So let's talk about some positive solutions or some things that we can all do to prevent this from happening. So we already talked about the factory and how point source pollution is not as common as it used to be in previous years. But let's move on to the farm. So the farmer had livestock that could enter the waterway, right? And when the sheep went to the river, it pooped. It went to the bathroom. What could the farmer do to keep the livestock from entering that waterway? Think about it. So think about how the river here kind of forms the border of that farm. Is there something else that maybe we could use as a border to prevent the livestock from entering the waterway? Well, yes, there certainly is. We could use something as simple as fencing, applying fences to those borders to keep the livestock from entering the waterway. And now you might be thinking, well, the lamb also went to the water, or the goat went to the water to take a drink. What happens if we fence them a river? How are they going to drink water? Well, plenty of farmers have actually brought the water to the animals. There are large containers that they can put on the farm that basically bring them the fresh water so that they can drink instead of going to the river's edge. So by building fences along those areas, we can persuade those animals to not enter the water and poop in it. So what about the farm? The part of the farm where the farmer was actually growing fruits and vegetables. Do you guys notice how the land that's being tilled goes all the way up to the water's edge? So that way, whenever it rained, all of the chemicals that were used, whether they were fertilizers or pesticides, all of that stuff just drained right into the water. Well, a farmer could leave a natural area of vegetation, and I say vegetation, but basically I mean plants. The farmer could leave trees, shrubs, wildflowers, sunflowers even, but an area of natural vegetation in place instead of tilling the ground all the way up to the water's edge. Or if they maybe are not close to a waterway, but they have a canal system that is being used to water those plants, farmers can build raised berms or areas of earth that have been raised to prevent a lot of that stuff from running off of the surface. The soil can absorb some of those pollutants or chemicals, but it's still a good idea to utilize plants in those areas because plants act like sponges. They can naturally absorb a lot of the stuff that might run off of the surface. So the farmer was using fertilizers, right, to grow some of those crops, some of the vegetables and fruits. What else could a farmer use that might be a natural form of fertilizer as opposed to using like a liquid chemical? Manure or compost. So certain manure or animal waste could actually be used on those farm fields to provide an organic means or a natural means of fertilizing those fruits and vegetables. So this is why sometimes you guys may have the ability to purchase organic vegetables and fruits in the grocery store. Those fruits and vegetables have been harvested or grown with little to no chemical use. So there are a lot of solutions that the farmer could take to prevent the water quality from becoming so bad in that area. Well, let's move on to our neighborhoods. This is where we live. So when Giganto Boy took Dogzilla out for a walk, Dogzilla went to the bathroom, right? What do you think would be a good idea to do, or a good practice to follow through with when you take your dogs out for walks outside? Well, if they're going to go to the bathroom, it's always a good idea to bring a trash bag or a pet waste bag. Some of you guys may know, you may already be using some of these things, but when we pick up after our pets, we prevent a lot of that pet waste from running off of the surface after it rains. So picking up after our pets is a good solution to avoid pet waste from entering those waterways. And then some of the chemicals that we use in our area. So it's nice to have grass where you use it, where you're playing on it, but if there's an area of the yard that's grass and no one ever uses that space, sometimes it's a good idea to consider using low water use plants or desert adapted plants around our homes and our yards. When we use desert adapted plants, we're actually saving water. We're limiting the amount of water we use to support those landscapes. But by using native desert plants that grow here in the Sonoran Desert in our yards, we help other organisms like native wildlife. We help save the bees because they're really important pollinators for us. We can attract hummingbirds or beneficial wildlife to our yards. Hummingbirds don't just drink the nectar from tubular-shaped flowers, they actually eat bugs too. A lot of our birds are insect feeders, and by encouraging some of these beneficial wildlife to come back to our yards because we're creating that wildlife habitat for them, you would be surprised sometimes the birds will go after some of the pests that we wouldn't naturally want to come inside of the home. So they're like natural pest removers as opposed to using things like pesticides to kill those bugs. So the birds can help do some of that work for us. Now, when we looked at those neighborhoods with some of the chemicals that we were growing or applying to the land like fertilizers, if we're limiting the amount of grass and we're using desert adapted plants, most desert adapted plants don't require any fertilizer at all. So you'd actually be lessening or significantly minimizing the amount of fertilizers and other chemicals that you would be using to maintain your front or backyards. So let's move on and talk about this area of development, remember? So whenever we're building houses or building more businesses, we churn up the earth. And there's an opportunity for erosion to occur. There are things that areas of development can use or put down on the ground to prevent dirt from leaving the work site, especially after a rain event. And that's something like a silt fence. So there are basically barriers that can be put down and around those spaces to prevent dirt from running off the surface of the land when it rains. We call them like silt fences. Sometimes you might see straw hay bales set up on site. But these are all, there's more than one different type of way. But ultimately when you see those at a work site or these, they almost kind of look like black sheets of fabric or little small low-level fences on the ground around those sites. Those are silt fences. They are being put up to minimize the amount of erosion in that area. Now, what about the golf course that's behind our neighborhoods and where we live? A golf course might be using lots of fertilizers, right? Well, if you're gonna use chemicals like fertilizers to keep the grass green, a golf course can be very mindful about how much they are using to use the appropriate amount of those fertilizers and try not to fertilize before a rain event. So paying close attention to the weather, because if we use those fertilizers or those liquid chemicals right before a rain event, as you guys could see, all that stuff was running right off the land and into those waterways. So a golf course can maybe limit the amount of fertilizers that they use. And many of the golf courses here in the central Arizona area are watered not with the same type of water that we have coming out of the tap or our faucets, but they are irrigating their golf courses or the grass with recycled water. So let's talk about the wastewater treatment plant. So this is an example of the wastewater treatment plant. And believe it or not, we've talked about some things that we can do to save water, because by saving water, you are helping to protect the current water supplies. Anytime you use water at home, whether you're brushing your teeth, you're flushing the toilet, taking a shower, if that water goes down the drain of your home, it goes down the sanitary sewer line. And those sanitary sewers, or the sewer system, is connected and ultimately ends up at a water treatment plant. So all that water that we send down the drain gets recycled. It gets cleaned. It runs through a series of filtration and treatment, and then it gets put back out into certain areas, like utilizing or watering our golf courses with recycled water. Or here in Glendale, you may notice some lakes in the northern part of the city. Some of that water is what we call effluent. It's highly treated wastewater or recycled water that we are using to maintain outdoor landscaping or to water large, long areas of grass. So this is another maybe beneficial use of water that a golf course could use. Now, one of the very last things that we talked about in terms of non-point source pollution was litter, right? We find litter everywhere. What can we do? Well, don't litter. Do not throw trash on the ground. Make sure that that trash ends up in a trash can or the dumpsters. There are a lot of things that we use in our everyday lives that can be used again. So if we consider what we are using, or if we reduce the amount of waste we are creating, some items that we come into contact and use every day can be recycled again. So just like we can recycle water, we can recycle certain forms of trash, like paper, plastic water bottles, soda cans. These are things that we even see on the ground. So if you see litter on the ground, you consider doing a community trash cleanup to make sure that that stuff goes back in the correct place. There's one other area that we didn't mention. When it began to rain in our neighborhood areas, along the roadways, we have something called storm drains. You guys might see these systems when you walk along the sidewalks in your neighborhood. Sometimes you will see a hole just up underneath what looks to be like a sewer or manhole cover. You can see that water might naturally run along the street, but then it goes down underneath the sidewalk areas. What that is going to is something called a storm drain. Now, the only thing that should ever enter a storm drain is water. Water from rain, water from maybe our irrigation system, but water alone. Whenever all of this stuff ends up on those surfaces and the monsoon rains come, as you guys could probably see, some of that stuff entered the stormwater system. A lot of people used to think that the water that entered that storm drain system went to our wastewater treatment plant to be cleaned, but that's actually a common myth. The storm drain system is completely separate of the sewer system. Those storm drains go down into the ground and they open up along our parks. So in your neighborhoods, you may have a lot of green, grassy community spaces that you play in, or a city park that may be nearby. That water that runs off the land ultimately ends up in those parks, and that water naturally over time can infiltrate back into the ground, but it can also continue to be carried to our waterways and affect the water quality. So it's always a good idea to never let anything but water go down those storm drains. So I hope you guys have learned a lot today about what watersheds are, how we can use them to determine where our water sources come from. Hopefully you guys learned a lot about water pollution and the two different types. And you also learned, while our waterways can become degraded here in our watershed area, there are tons of different things that we can do. Whether it's here at home, on a farm, or whenever we're driving, things that we can do, practical ways that we can do throughout the rest of our lives to help keep those waterways clean. Because eventually, as that water drains off the land, it ends up at that common point or that low point on land, and it actually happens to be an important area of our drinking water supply. So hopefully you guys learned a lot today. Stay tuned for our next lesson where we talk about the water that we can't easily see underneath us, our groundwater.